August 14, 1923. Harlan County, Kentucky. When federal revenue agent Thomas Mitchell's body was discovered in a shallow creek bed 3 miles from Pine Mountain, the coroner counted 47 puncture wounds covering his torso and limbs. His service revolver remained holstered, his badge had been torn from his chest, and scattered around his corpse were paw prints, dozens of them, pressed deep into the mud, each one belonging to dogs that had been trained for one purpose, to kill on command. Mitchell wasn't the first federal agent to disappear in these mountains. But what investigators found when they finally tracked the animals to their owner's property would expose a network of violence so systematic, so carefully orchestrated, that it would force Washington to completely rethink how they prosecuted Prohibition in Appalachia. Because the man who trained those bloodhounds, a moonshiner named Ezekiel Harmon, had vanished without a trace, and the secrets buried on his land were far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the Appalachian moonshiners' bloodhounds and what really happened in the mountains of Kentucky during the darkest days of Prohibition, make sure to subscribe to the FEAR Abbey and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's most chilling mysteries. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers across the globe. Now let's descend into the shadows of 1923. The year 1923 marked the 4th year of national prohibition in America, but in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, the 18th Amendment might as well have been written in a foreign language. These weren't hills, they were fortresses. The Appalachian terrain of Harlan County rose in brutal elevation changes, covered in dense hardwood forests that had stood for centuries. Roads were scarce, often little more than wagon trails that became impassable rivers of mud during spring rains. The hollers, narrow valleys cutting between steep ridges, could hide entire operations from the outside world. For generations, moonshining had been more than just a business in these mountains. It was culture. It was survival. When your grandfather made whiskey, and his grandfather before him, the arrival of federal agents wasn't seen as law enforcement, it was seen as invasion. The mountain people had their own justice system, their own codes, and their own way of dealing with outsiders who threatened their livelihood. Harlan County in 1923 was a powder keg. The coal mining industry dominated the economy, but the mines paid poorly and the work killed young. Moonshining offered an alternative, a way for a man to feed his family without destroying his lungs in the dark. The quality of Kentucky moonshine was legendary. Clear as spring water, smooth as silk when made right, it commanded premium prices in cities from Cincinnati to Chicago. But the profits attracted attention from more than just thirsty customers. Ezekiel Harmon was 38 years old in the summer of 1923. To those who knew him casually, he seemed unremarkable. A quiet man of average height with calloused hands and a weathered face that made him look a decade older than his years. He lived alone in a cabin 7 miles up Cranks Creek, accessible only by a trail that crossed the water 3 times and required intimate knowledge of the terrain to navigate safely. Zeke had inherited the property from his father, who had operated a still there since before the turn of the century. But Zeke had expanded the operation considerably. Neighbors reported seeing him make trips to town every few weeks for supplies. Sugar, copper, yeast, mason jars. Always paid in cash. Never caused trouble. Attended church occasionally at the Pine Mountain Baptist congregation, though he sat in the back and left before the final hymn. What set Zeke apart? What made him different from the dozens of other moonshiners working the hollers of Harlan County were his dogs. He had started with 2 bloodhounds in 1920, puppies he'd acquired from a breeder in Tennessee who specialized in tracking dogs for law enforcement. By 1923, he had 8 adult bloodhounds and 3 younger dogs still in training. Locals who passed his property described hearing them at night, not barking but something else. A low, sustained howling that echoed through the valleys and made people close their windows even in summer heat. Zeke trained them dogs like no one I ever seen, recalled Martha Collings in a 1924 interview with federal investigators, one of the few documented testimonies preserved in the National Archives. Martha lived with her husband and 4 children in a cabin 2 miles downstream from Zeke's property. My husband Virgil seen him working with them up on the ridge one time, had them attacking burlap sacks he'd stuffed with something. The dogs would tear into those sacks like they was trying to get at something alive inside. Virgil said it gave him a powerful bad feeling. The revenue agents had been targeting Harlan County with increasing aggression throughout early 1923. Washington was tired of the mountain moonshiners making fools of federal law. The Bureau of Prohibition, established just 3 years earlier, was under pressure to show results. Agents were younger now, more aggressive, often recruited from outside the region specifically because they had no family ties that might compromise their loyalty. That's where Thomas Mitchell came in. 26 years old, originally from Indianapolis, he'd been a revenue agent for only 14 months when he was assigned to the Harlan County district. His supervisor's notes preserved in federal records describe him as enthusiastic but inexperienced in mountain work. Mitchell had successfully raided 3 stills in his first month in Kentucky, making arrests and destroying equipment. He was building a reputation. He was making enemies. The first indication that something was different about Zeke Harmon's operation came in March of 1923, though no one recognized it as such at the time. Revenue agent David Wilcox and his partner Samuel Price were working their way up Cranks Creek, following tips about still smoke spotted from the ridgeline. It was standard procedure. 2 agents, both armed, moving quietly through the woods in early morning when the stillmen would be running their operations. They never made it to Zeke's property. 2 miles downstream from the cabin, they encountered the dogs. They came out of nowhere, Wilcox reported in his official statement dated March 18, 1923. We didn't hear them approaching, no barking, no warning. Suddenly there were 4 of them blocking the trail ahead of us. The biggest one had to be over 100 pounds, was at the front. They weren't acting like normal dogs, no tail wagging, no sniffing around. They just stood there, staring at us. Price tried to talk to them gentle-like, the way you would with any dog. That big one took 3 steps forward. I drew my weapon. The dog didn't react, just kept staring. Price said we should back away slow. That's what we did. Took us 20 minutes to back down that trail. The dogs followed us the whole way, maintaining the same distance, never making a sound. When we reached the creek crossing about a mile down, they just stopped, watched us cross, then disappeared back into the trees. The report was filed. Nothing came of it. Moonshine country was dangerous territory. Dogs were a common security measure. The incident was noted but not investigated. 6 weeks later, revenue agent Marcus Webb had a similar encounter on the northern approach to Zeke's property. This time there were 5 dogs. Webb was a veteran, 43 years old, with 12 years of federal law enforcement experience. He'd served as a deputy marshal in Oklahoma before transferring to Prohibition enforcement. His report, dated May 2nd, 1923, was more detailed and significantly more concerned. These animals exhibited behavior I have never witnessed in canines, Webb wrote. They moved with military precision, maintaining formation, 2 flanking positions, 2 blocking the trail ahead, 1 circling behind to cut off retreat. When I fired my weapon into the air as a deterrent, they did not scatter or show typical fear responses. The rear dog rushed forward aggressively. I was forced to fire a warning shot directly in front of the lead animal. Only then did they withdraw, but in an organized fashion, backing away while maintaining eye contact. This was not natural dog behavior. These animals have been trained for combat. Webb recommended that any future operations near the Harmon property be conducted with larger teams, and that agents should be briefed on the presence of potentially dangerous guard animals. His supervisor, District Chief Robert Calloway, filed the report but took no immediate action. Resources were limited. Every moonshiner in Harlan County had dogs. This didn't seem exceptional enough to warrant special protocols. The 3rd incident occurred on July 9, 1923, and this time the dogs drew blood. Agents Henry Foster and James Rutledge were conducting surveillance from a ridge overlooking Cranks Creek. They weren't even attempting to approach Zeke's property, just observing from a distance, making notes about smoke patterns and vehicle traffic. They had positioned themselves in a dense thicket of laurel approximately 3/4 of a mile from the nearest trail. According to Foster's medical report and testimony given 2 weeks later from his hospital bed in Harlan, the attack came at dusk. We'd been there since dawn. Hadn't seen anything unusual all day. Jim was using binoculars. I was making notes in my logbook. We hadn't made any noise, hadn't lit a fire, hadn't done anything to give away our position. Then Jim whispered, "Jesus Christ," and I looked up. There were dogs, 7 of them, spread out in a semicircle. They'd surrounded us completely and we never heard them coming. What happened next lasted less than 3 minutes but left Foster with 13 lacerations requiring over 60 stitches and Rutledge with severe injuries to his right arm that would eventually require partial amputation. The big one, the lead dog. He looked right at me and I saw it in his eyes, Foster later told investigators. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. This was something else. Something trained. He waited, like he was giving us a chance to run. I went for my weapon. That's when they attacked. Rutledge managed to fire 3 shots, killing 1 dog and wounding another before the pack retreated. But the damage was done. Both agents required immediate medical evacuation. The incident finally triggered a serious response from federal authorities. District Chief Calloway launched a formal inquiry. He reviewed all previous reports of encounters with dogs near the Harmon property. He interviewed locals who had witnessed Zeke's training methods. What emerged was a disturbing pattern. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Zeke drilling his dogs using commands that weren't standard for hunting or tracking animals. One farmer named Isaiah Turpin told investigators he'd heard Zeke shouting "hunt and kill" while working with the animals on his property. Another neighbor, Ellen Masters, described seeing Zeke in town purchasing large quantities of raw meat, far more than one man and his dogs would need for normal feeding. He was training them to hunt people, Calloway wrote in his summary report dated July 25, 1923. This isn't speculation, the evidence is clear. Harmon has weaponized these animals specifically to target law enforcement. This represents a new and dangerous escalation in the resistance to prohibition enforcement in eastern Kentucky. But the most chilling detail came from a moonshiner named Curtis Brock, who had worked briefly with Zeke. In 1922, before they'd had a falling out over territory, Brock, hoping to reduce charges on his own recent arrest, provided information to federal agents that wouldn't be made public for decades. Zeke told me once that revenue agents weren't the real problem, Brock stated in his deposition. He said the problem was people thinking they could just walk into these mountains and take what belonged to mountain folk. He said his dogs would teach them different. He said by the time he was done training them, they'd be able to track a man for miles, take him down without killing him right away, and hold him until Zeke decided what to do next. I thought he was just drunk and talking big, but the way he said it, there was something cold in his voice, something that made me never want to cross him. By late July, federal authorities had made a decision. Ezekiel Harmon's operation would be raided, his dogs would be destroyed, and he would be arrested on multiple federal charges including assault on federal officers, operation of an illegal distillery, and a new charge being considered by prosecutors training animals as weapons against law enforcement. The raid was scheduled for August 12, 1923. Revenue agent Thomas Mitchell volunteered to lead the team. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. Let's discover what happens next in the mountains of Kentucky. August 12, 1923 dawned clear and hot over Harlan County. Revenue agent Thomas Mitchell assembled his team at the federal office in the county seat at 4:30 a.m. There were 6 agents total, Mitchell plus veterans Marcus Webb and David Wilcox, along with 3 younger agents, Robert Cornwall, James Denton, and Peter Yoshida, one of the few Asian American federal agents serving in Appalachia at the time. Mitchell's operational plan, preserved in federal archives, was thorough. The team would split into 2 groups. Mitchell, Cornwall, and Denton would approach from the south, following Cranks Creek directly to the property. Webb, Wilcox, and Yoshida would circle west and come in from the ridgeline, establishing a perimeter to prevent escape. All agents were armed with service revolvers and rifles. Cornwall carried a shotgun specifically for dealing with the dogs if necessary. They departed at 5:15 a.m. The plan was to reach the property by 7 a.m. and execute the raid while Zeke would likely be running his still distracted and easier to apprehend. Mitchell's team reached the southern approach to the property at 6:45 a.m. Everything seemed normal. Birds singing, creek burbling over stones, no sign of dogs, no sign of human activity. Mitchell signaled for his team to move forward. They never made it to the cabin. 3/4 of a mile from the property line, the dogs appeared. But this time, something was different. The animals weren't blocking the trail or maintaining a defensive perimeter. They were agitated. 2 of them were injured, fresh wounds visible on their flanks and shoulders. Blood matted their fur, and they were behaving erratically, pacing back and forth, whining, occasionally releasing short, sharp barks that echoed through the holler. "Something's wrong," Cornwall whispered to Mitchell. "Dogs don't act like this unless—" That's when they saw the first body. It was hung from a tree branch 15 feet off the ground, suspended by rope around the torso. A revenue agent's uniform, though the body had been positioned in such a way that identification was initially impossible. The corpse had been savaged, massive trauma to the limbs and torso consistent with large animal attacks. Mitchell immediately signaled for his team to take defensive positions while he attempted to approach the body. The dogs didn't attack. They backed away. Mitchell examined the body for approximately 3 minutes before retreating to his team's position. His hands were shaking. According to Cornwall's testimony given later, that day Mitchell's face had gone completely white. "We need to signal Webb's team," Mitchell said. "We need to signal them right now, and then we need to get federal marshals and the state police. This isn't a still operation, this is something else entirely." but it was too late for warnings. From the ridgeline above, they heard the crack of rifle fire. 3 shots in rapid succession, the signal that Webb's team had encountered trouble. Then screaming, human screaming that cut off abruptly. Mitchell made the decision that likely saved his team's lives. He ordered an immediate retreat. The 3 agents backed down the trail, weapons drawn, while the dogs followed at a distance, but still not attacking. It was only later that investigators understood why. The animals were traumatized. Whatever had happened on that property had affected the dogs as much as the humans. Mitchell's team reached the creek crossing and continued downstream at a run until they reached the nearest cabin, the Collings family property. Martha Collings later described the agents as looking like they'd seen the devil himself. Mitchell used the family's telephone to contact federal authorities and request immediate backup. Within 2 hours, a force of 15 federal marshals, 10 Kentucky state police officers, and a dozen deputized local lawmen had assembled. Sheriff Clayton Hughes, a 30-year veteran of Harlan County law enforcement, took overall command. At 11:00 a.m., the combined force moved up Cranks Creek toward Ezekiel Harmon's property. What they found would be documented in over 300 pages of investigative reports, crime scene photographs that remain sealed to this day, and testimony from nearly 40 witnesses. The official summary, declassified in 1995, describes the scene with clinical precision, but the horror is evident in every line. The cabin itself appeared undisturbed from the outside. Zeke's truck was parked next to the structure. The still, a sophisticated operation with multiple copper kettles and condensing coils, was cold, clearly not operated for at least several days. But surrounding the cabin, in a rough circle approximately 50 yards in diameter, were the bodies. Revenue Agent Marcus Webb was found 30 yards from the cabin, partially hidden in underbrush. He had been shot twice, once in the chest, once in the head. His service revolver was missing. His badge had been removed. The medical examiner's report noted defensive wounds on his hands and forearms, suggesting he had attempted to protect himself from blunt force trauma before being shot. Revenue Agent David Wilcox was discovered near the still itself. He had died from a combination of gunshot wounds and what the coroner described as massive blood loss from injuries consistent with large animal attacks. The tissue damage to his legs and lower torso suggested prolonged assault. His service revolver was found 6 feet from his body empty, all 6 rounds fired, though only one spent casing was recovered from the scene, suggesting he had fired at his attackers before being overwhelmed. Revenue Agent Peter Yoshida's body was the one Mitchell had seen hanging from the tree. The autopsy revealed he had been shot in the back while attempting to flee, then subsequently hung post-mortem. The dog attacks had occurred after death. Yoshida's personal effects, wallet, badge, identification papers, were found scattered around the base of the tree, as if someone had gone through them methodically. But the most disturbing discoveries were yet to come. Behind the cabin, investigators found what appeared to be a training area, a cleared space approximately 40 feet across where the ground was torn up and soaked with old blood. Scattered throughout this area were pieces of federal uniforms, torn and shredded. Some appeared to be months old, weathered by exposure. Others were relatively fresh. None of the clothing matched the 3 dead agents' uniforms. Sheriff Hughes ordered his men to search the surrounding woods systematically. They found 2 more bodies within the first hour. Both had been dead for weeks, possibly months. Both wore revenue agent uniforms. Both had been shot execution style, single gunshot wounds to the back of the head. Both had subsequently been subjected to extensive animal attacks. The bodies were badly decomposed, making immediate identification impossible, though dental records would eventually confirm their identities. The first was Revenue Agent Charles Brennan, 34 years old, who had been reported missing in April 1923 after failing to return from a solo reconnaissance mission in Harlan County. His family had been told he likely deserted his post, a not uncommon occurrence among revenue agents who faced constant danger and poor pay. The second was Revenue Agent Leonard Morrison, 41 years old, missing since February 1923. His case file had been marked presumed deceased, but no body had ever been found. His wife had remarried just 3 weeks before his remains were identified. The kennel area revealed even darker truths. 8 dogs were found dead on the property, shot with what appeared to be a large caliber rifle. The animals had been killed methodically, each one shot in the head at close range. 3 had been dead for approximately 2 days based on the state of decomposition. 5 had been killed more recently, within 12 to 18 hours of the raid. But here's what made investigators' blood run cold. The 3 dogs killed first showed signs of having been starved. Their ribs were visible. Food dishes in the kennel were empty, bone dry, covered in dust. Water troughs were drained. Someone had deliberately withheld food and water from these animals for days, perhaps longer. The 5 dogs killed more recently were well fed, their stomachs contained meat, and according to the veterinary pathologist who examined them, some of that meat was consistent with human tissue. Sheriff Hughes made the decision to excavate the property. Over the next 3 days, his team dug up the area around the cabin, the training ground, and several suspicious depressions in the forest floor nearby. What they found forced the federal government to classify portions of the investigation for over 7 decades. 4 more bodies, all federal revenue agents. All shot execution style. All showing evidence of having been held captive for periods ranging from hours to potentially days before being killed. Ligature marks on wrists and ankles. Evidence of torture. One victim had been alive when the dogs were allowed to attack. The defense wounds and trauma patterns made this horrifically clear. The remains were in various states of decomposition, suggesting the killings had occurred over a period of months. The earliest victim appeared to have been buried in late 1922. The most recent, aside from the 3 agents killed during the August 12th raid, had been buried approximately 3 weeks before the raid. But Ezekiel Harmon was nowhere to be found. His personal effects remained in the cabin: clothing, money, personal documents. His truck had fuel in the tank, and the keys were on the kitchen table. There was food in the cupboards, some of it fresh enough to suggest he'd been there within the last few days. But the man himself had vanished. A massive manhunt was launched. Federal agents combed the mountains for weeks. Bloodhounds, tragic irony, were brought in to track his scent. Every holler, every cave, every cabin within a 20-mile radius was searched. Local moonshiners were interrogated. Family members were pressured. A reward of $5,000 was offered for information leading to his capture, an enormous sum in 1923. Ezekiel Harmon was never found. The federal investigation into what became known as the Cranks Creek murders would ultimately involve over 70 investigators from multiple agencies and generate more than 2,000 pages of documentation. What emerged was a portrait of systematic violence that had been operating in plain sight for over a year, protected by the mountain's isolation and the local population's deep distrust of federal authority. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Zeke's sister, Rebecca Harmon Dalton, who lived in Lynch, Kentucky, 30 miles from the murder scene. On August 20th, 1923, 8 days after the discovery of the bodies, Rebecca contacted federal authorities with information that she claimed had been weighing on her soul. According to her testimony preserved in the National Archives, Zeke had visited her in early July, weeks before the final murders. He had seemed agitated, spoke of reckoning coming, and made cryptic references to teaching lessons that needed teaching. Most significantly, he told her that if anything happened to him, she should tell authorities to look in the old root cellar behind the cabin, under the false floor. Investigators had already searched the property extensively, but they'd found only a standard root cellar, empty except for some preserved vegetables and moonshine jugs. Rebecca's information sent them back. This time they brought mining equipment and engineers familiar with the mountain terrain. What they discovered was an underground chamber extending beneath and beyond the original root cellar, a sophisticated hiding space carved from the limestone bedrock, accessible through a concealed trapdoor beneath what appeared to be the solid stone floor of the cellar. The space was approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, 7 feet high, and contained evidence that transformed the investigation from a murder case into something far more disturbing. The chamber held detailed records. Zeke had kept a journal, 127 pages in a leather-bound ledger, written in cramped handwriting with dates and observations. The entries began in December 1922 and continued through August 9, 1923, just 3 days before the final raid. The journal revealed that Zeke had not been acting alone. Though he never named his collaborators directly, the entries made clear that he had support from at least 3 other individuals, possibly more. References to J bringing supplies, M providing intelligence about federal operations, and the Patterson brothers helping with disposal appeared throughout the text. The entries documented a deliberate campaign of violence against revenue agents. Zeke described his methodology with chilling precision. He would use his dogs to track federal agents entering the area. The animals had been trained to follow scent trails, locate targets, and drive them toward predetermined locations where Zeke and his associates would be waiting. Some agents were killed immediately. Others were held captive, sometimes for days, while Zeke interrogated them about federal operations, future raids, and the identities of local informants. Caught another one today, read the entry from April 8, 1923. Fellow couldn't be more than 25. Told him if he gave me names of the local folks feeding information to Federals, I'd let him walk out of here. He believed me for a while. Gave me 3 names, 2 I already knew about. Third was a surprise. Never would have suspected old man Turner of talking to revenue men. Fellow figured out eventually that I wasn't letting him go. Tried to bargain with money, then with information about upcoming raids. Too late by then. Dogs needed feeding anyway. The entry concluded with a simple notation. Buried him at the east end of the training ground. Dogs did good work. Federal investigators matched this entry to the remains of revenue agent Christopher Daniels, 26 years old, who had been reported missing in April. His body was among those recovered from the property. The old man Turner referenced in the journal was identified as Samuel Turner, 63, who lived 4 miles downstream from Zeke's cabin. Turner was found dead in his home 3 days after the journal was discovered. Apparent suicide by hanging, though some investigators suspected murder made to look like suicide. The journal also revealed Zeke's training methodology for the dogs. He had been conditioning them through a process that began with teaching them to track human scent, progressed to attacking dummies dressed in federal uniforms, and culminated in what he called live exercises, using captive federal agents as training targets while the victim was restrained. The dogs understand now, he wrote in June. They know the smell of federal men, the gun oil, the city soap, the leather of their boots. They know that smell means hunt, means kill. Started with Rex just lunging at the bag. Now all 8 of them work together like soldiers. They corner, they separate, they wait for the command. Beautiful to watch. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the journal was Zeke's motive. This wasn't simply about protecting his moonshine operation. The entries revealed a man who had developed an obsessive hatred of federal authority, rooted in a personal tragedy that investigators were able to verify through historical records. In 1919, Zeke's younger brother Daniel had been killed during a raid on their father's still. Daniel was 17 years old. The circumstances were disputed. Federal agents claimed Daniel had drawn a weapon. Local witnesses said he was shot while trying to surrender. No agent was ever charged. The incident had radicalized Zeke, transforming him from a relatively peaceful moonshiner into someone committed to violent resistance. They took my brother, he wrote in one of the earliest journal entries, shot him down like a dog over some whiskey, didn't even get a trial, didn't even get justice. Nobody cared because we were just mountain people making mountain medicine. Well, they're going to learn. Every federal man who comes into these hills is going to learn what it means to cross mountain people. By the time I'm done, they're going to be too scared to come up here. They're going to leave us alone. The investigation expanded to identify Zeke's accomplices. Federal agents arrested 23 people over the following months on charges ranging from conspiracy to murder to obstruction of justice. The trials would drag on for over 2 years. The most significant arrests were James Jim Burkhart and Martin Marty Sizemore, both local moonshiners who had worked with Zeke. Faced with the death penalty, both men cooperated with authorities. Their testimony painted a picture of a carefully organized conspiracy. According to Burkhart, Zeke had recruited him in early 1923 with promises of protection and profit. He said the Federals were getting too bold, coming into the mountains like they owned the place. Said we needed to make an example, make them understand that there were places they weren't welcome. He made it sound like we were defending our homes, our way of life. Didn't seem wrong at the time, seemed like justice. Sizemore provided more specific details about individual murders. He admitted to participating in the capture and killing of revenue agent Leonard Morrison in February 1923. Zeke's dogs tracked him up near Black Mountain. Morrison put up a fight, shot one of the dogs, wounded another. That just made Zeke angrier. We held him for 2 days while Zeke tried to get information out of him about upcoming raids. Morrison wouldn't talk. Zeke finally shot him. We buried him on the property. The dogs had already been at him by then. The Patterson brothers mentioned in Zeke's journal were identified as Earl and Vernon Patterson, cousins who operated a moonshine distribution network. They were arrested attempting to flee to West Virginia. Earl Patterson hanged himself in his cell before trial. Vernon was convicted on 3 counts of conspiracy to murder federal officers and sentenced to life in prison, where he would die in 1947. But the most disturbing revelation came from Martha Collings, the neighbor who had initially reported suspicious activity at Zeke's property. In a detailed interview conducted in September 1923, she revealed that the local community had known something terrible was happening on Zeke's land, but had collectively chosen to ignore it. We'd hear things at night, Martha told investigators. Screaming sometimes when the wind was right, dogs howling but not natural howling. My husband Virgil wanted to go check on it a couple times, but I told him to mind his own business. That's the mountain way. You don't stick your nose in another man's affairs. Now I know we heard them men dying and we did nothing. That's going to haunt me until my own dying day. Her testimony revealed a pattern of willful blindness throughout the community. Multiple families had heard suspicious sounds. Several men had encountered Zeke transporting suspicious cargo covered with tarps in his truck. At least one person had found a federal agent's badge discarded near the creek and never reported it. The mountain's culture of silence had enabled the murders to continue for over a year. The legal proceedings were complicated by jurisdictional issues and local sentiment. Harlan County juries were reluctant to convict mountain people for crimes against federal agents, even when the evidence was overwhelming. The first trial, of James Burkhart, ended in a hung jury despite his confession. Federal prosecutors had to appeal to the state Supreme Court to have subsequent trials moved to Frankfort, the state capital, where they could get impartial juries. Ultimately, 7 men were convicted of various charges related to the Cranks Creek murders. 3 received death sentences, later commuted to life imprisonment. 4 received sentences ranging from 20 to 40 years. Dozens more were convicted of lesser charges: obstruction of justice, conspiracy, accessory after the fact. But the investigation's central mystery remained unsolved. What happened to Ezekiel Harmon? The FBI, then just 29 years old as an agency, took over the manhunt. J. Edgar Hoover, who had been appointed director just months earlier, saw the case as an opportunity to demonstrate federal law enforcement's reach. He assigned some of his best agents to the search. Theories abounded. Some believed Zeke had fled to Canada or Mexico. Others thought he'd gone deep into the mountains, perhaps living in one of the countless caves that pockmarked the region. A few speculated he'd been killed by his own conspirators to prevent him from testifying. The most persistent rumor, never proven, was that he'd had help from corrupt local officials who had provided him with advance warning of the August 12th raid. The last confirmed sighting of Zeke came from a clerk at a general store in Ivarts, Kentucky, on August 10, 1923, 2 days before the raid. He had purchased cigarettes and ammunition. The clerk remembered him seeming calm, even cheerful. He'd asked about the weather forecast. He'd paid in cash. Then he'd walked out and disappeared into history. Over the following decades, there would be occasional reported sightings. Someone matching his description spotted in Montana in 1928, in Oregon in 1934, in British Columbia in 1941. None were ever confirmed. The FBI kept the case open until 1963, 40 years after the murders, before finally closing it as unsolved. The Cranks Creek murders fundamentally changed how federal authorities approached prohibition enforcement in Appalachia. The Bureau of Prohibition, already struggling with limited resources and hostile local populations, was forced to completely revise its operational protocols for mountain regions. New regulations implemented in late 1923 and early 1924 prohibited revenue agents from conducting solo operations in eastern Kentucky, western Virginia, and similar mountainous regions. All raids had to be conducted by teams of at least 6 agents, with mandatory check-ins every 4 hours. Local law enforcement was required to be notified of federal operations, despite concerns about corruption. Agents were provided with additional weapons training and, for the first time, authorized to carry Thompson submachine guns when conducting raids in designated high-risk areas. The psychological impact on revenue agents was severe. Recruitment for positions in Appalachia dropped by over 60% following the murders. The Bureau had to increase pay and offer bonuses to convince agents to accept postings in mountain regions. Many experienced agents requested transfers out of Kentucky and Tennessee. The fear was palpable. Federal law enforcement had been shown to be vulnerable, and moonshiners throughout the region took note. But perhaps more significantly, the murders exposed deep failures in how the federal government understood and interacted with Appalachian communities. Congressional hearings held in 1924 examined not just the Cranks Creek murders, but the broader question of why prohibition was proving essentially unenforceable in large swaths of America. Representative James Anderson of Kentucky testified before the House Judiciary Committee. These mountains have their own culture, their own laws, their own way of life that predates this nation. You cannot simply declare that generations of tradition are now illegal and expect compliance. The people see revenuers not as law enforcement but as invaders. Until we understand that, until we address the economic desperation that drives moonshining in the first place, we will continue to see violence. The hearings led to reforms, though they came too late, for the men who died at Cranks Creek. The Bureau of Prohibition established liaisons with local communities, attempted to provide alternative economic opportunities, and in some cases simply looked the other way when small-scale moonshining operations kept a low profile. The case also revealed uncomfortable truths about how rural communities policed themselves, or failed to. The willful blindness of Zeke's neighbors raised questions about collective responsibility. When does minding your own business become complicity? When does mountain independence become a shield for atrocity? Several academic studies in the decades that followed examined the Cranks Creek murders as a case study in vigilante justice and domestic terrorism. Dr. Eleanor Bradshaw's 1967 monograph, Violence and Community in Appalachian Prohibition, argued that Zeke represented an extreme manifestation of cultural resistance to outside authority. He crossed the line from resistance to terrorism, Bradshaw wrote, but he did so with the tacit support of a community that shared his grievances even if they didn't share his methods. The legacy affected law enforcement training for generations. The FBI Academy began including the Cranks Creek case in its curriculum as an example of how individual radicalization, community enabling, and tactical failures could combine into catastrophe. The case was studied alongside other domestic terrorism incidents, analyzed for warning signs that might have been heeded. The impact on the families of the victims was profound and lasting. Widows of the murdered agents struggled to collect death benefits, as the federal government initially denied claims on the grounds that the men had died while engaging in unnecessarily dangerous conduct by approaching Zeke's property despite previous warnings. It took an act of Congress in 1925 to authorize full benefits and establish a fund for the families. Thomas Mitchell's widow, Emma, became an advocate for improved protection and compensation for federal law enforcement officers. Her testimony before Congress in 1926 was instrumental in passing reforms. "My husband died doing his duty," she told legislators. "He died because his government sent him into danger without proper support, without adequate intelligence, without even acknowledging how dangerous the mission truly was." How many more widows will there be before we admit that prohibition as currently enforced is failing? The question resonated. By 1933, the 21st Amendment would repeal prohibition entirely. While many factors contributed to repeal, the violence in Appalachia, and Cranks Creek specifically, became symbols of prohibition's unsustainable human cost. Interestingly, moonshining in Harlan County didn't end with prohibition's repeal. The tradition continued, now driven by avoiding taxation rather than avoiding the law entirely. But the violence diminished. Federal agents and moonshiners reached an unspoken accommodation. Small operations were tolerated, large-scale commercial production was prosecuted, but the days of deadly confrontation were largely over. The dogs became an oddly enduring element of the story. The 3 bloodhounds that had survived, traumatized but alive, were taken by federal agents. Unable to rehabilitate them for civilian life, the animals were eventually euthanized. But the image of attack dogs trained to hunt federal agents entered Appalachian folklore, appearing in songs, stories, and local legends. Some versions romanticized Zeke as a folk hero standing against government oppression. Others portrayed him as a monster who had betrayed mountain values by crossing into pure evil. The truth, as usual, was more complicated. Zeke had been both, a man defending his community and a serial killer who had methodically murdered at least 9 federal agents and probably more. His victims were doing their jobs, enforcing laws they didn't write, trying to support their families. The tragedy was that both Zeke and his victims were products of a system that had put them in opposition, and then provided no path to resolution except violence. The mountain community itself was forever changed. The scrutiny following the murders brought outside attention that many residents had spent generations avoiding. Property was seized, families were interrogated, and the federal presence in Harlan County increased dramatically. The events created divisions. Some families had cooperated with investigators, others had remained silent, and the resulting tension lasted for decades. By the 1950s, as coal mining declined and younger generations left the mountains for opportunities elsewhere, the old moonshining culture began to fade. Cranks Creek itself became something of a ghost area, the Harmon property abandoned, the cabins of neighbors demolished or left to rot. Local people avoided the area, speaking of it in hushed tones as cursed ground. Today, a century after the Cranks Creek murders, the site where Ezekiel Harmon's cabin stood is marked only by a foundation stone and the remnants of his still, rusted into the earth. The forest has reclaimed the property. The training ground where he drilled his dogs to hunt humans is indistinguishable from the surrounding woods. Nothing remains to indicate that this quiet hollow was once the scene of systematic murder. But the questions linger, echoing through the hollers like those bloodhounds' howls that kept Martha Collings awake at night. What drove a man to transform from a simple moonshiner into a serial killer of federal agents? Was it truly just revenge for his brother's death? Or was there something deeper, a darkness that the mountains and isolation cultivated until it consumed him entirely? How many victims were there really? 9 bodies were recovered, but Zeke's journal contained cryptic references that suggested there might have been others, perhaps killed earlier and buried in locations never discovered. The FBI estimated he might have been responsible for up to 15 murders, though only 9 could be definitively confirmed. And the central mystery, where did Ezekiel Harmon go? Did he die in those mountains, perhaps killed in a fight with his own conspirators who wanted to silence him? Did he successfully escape and live out his years under an assumed name in some distant place? Or did he simply walk deeper into the wilderness, into one of those endless caves or hidden hollers, choosing to disappear forever rather than face justice? Some locals insist they know. Whispers passed down through generations speak of a man matching Zeke's description who appeared occasionally in remote communities during the 1920s and 1930s, always alone, never staying long, moving like a ghost through the mountains he knew better than anyone. An old woman in Lynch, Kentucky, interviewed in the 1970s, claimed her grandfather had sheltered Zeke in 1925, that he'd seemed broken and haunted, that he'd spoken of the men he killed with something like remorse. But these stories can never be verified. They exist in the realm between history and legend. What we do know is this: the Cranks Creek murders represented a moment when American society confronted the human cost of laws that couldn't be enforced, policies that drove good people to violence, and the consequences of neglecting communities until they felt they had no choice but to fight back with whatever means they possessed. The bloodhounds of Cranks Creek weren't just animals trained to kill. They were symbols of resistance pushed to its darkest extreme, of authority imposed without understanding, of a conflict that consumed everyone it touched. What do you think happened to Ezekiel Harmon? Did he deserve sympathy for defending his way of life? Or was he simply a murderer who deserved no quarter? Could the murders have been prevented if federal authorities had approached Appalachian moonshining differently? And what about the neighbors who heard screaming and did nothing? Were they victims of mountain culture or complicit in the murders through their silence? Leave your theories in the comments below. This story raises questions about justice, community, and how far resistance can go before it becomes terrorism. These are questions without easy answers, but they're worth discussing. Subscribe to the FEAR Abbey for more lost chapters of American history, the dark stories that shaped who we are, the crimes that changed how we enforce laws, the mysteries that remain unsolved. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode, because history's darkest corners deserve to be examined, understood, and remembered. See you in the next video. Until then, stay curious, stay critical, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we create through our own policies and prejudices. The mountains keep their secrets, but we'll keep searching for the truth.